I want to remind us that the cafe will be recorded. So let us begin with a short reflection. And as is our custom, to remember that we come into God's holy presence. Let us not rush to the language of healing before understanding the fullness of the injury and the depth of the wound. Let us not rush past the loss of this mother's child, this father's child, someone's beloved son or daughter. Let us not be afraid to sit with the ugliness, the messiness, and the pain that is life in community together. Let us mourn Black and brown women and men, those killed extrajudicially. Let us call for the mourning men and the wailing women, those willing to rend their garments of privilege and ease and sit in the ashes of this nation's original sin. Let us be silent when we don't know what to say. Let us be humble and listen to the pain, rage, and grief pouring from the lips of our neighbors and friends. God, in your mercy, show me my own complicity in injustice. Convict me for my indifference. Forgive me when I have remained silent. Equip me with a zeal for justice and social transformation. Never let me grow accustomed or acclimated to injustice. The Lasallian educational heritage affirms that education is more than fact, figures, and skills. Education forms a person for maturity, bringing into fulfillment one's graced capacities to build societies where peace, equity, social justice, civic participation, the raising up of common dreams, and respect for freedom and differences are possible. So let us remain committed for the long haul. The struggle for justice and the struggle for peace is a long distance run. Find a way to rest, because this battle of ours isn't going to end soon. Amen. Before I turn it over to Tara, I've been invited just to have the privilege to share with everyone the website of the Joint Commission on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. If you are not yet familiar with the work of the Commission, you can, at your leisure, go to the Commission's website, where you will find, among other things, resources, as well as updates of the Commission's current work and the direction that the Commission is going. So without further ado, let me turn it back to Tara for our wonderful program this afternoon.
Thank you, brother, and welcome again to those gathered. Thank you for taking time today. We recognize that we feel a variety of emotions, ranging from anger and rage to frustration, grief, exhaustion, and others. And so we thank you for making some time today to be in community. I'd like to point to just two quick things before getting started in the cafe, for the cafe itself. The first is that there are a number of people here today who are here because they are art history students. And so Dr. Siobhan Carnegie will be sharing in the chat box a Google form, a link to a Google form. And we ask those of you who are in her courses to click when it's available. And then second, we want to say that in no way did we, of course, anticipate the events here in West Philly of just 2 nights ago. And we feel in some ways some degree of relief that this week's cafe is in fact connected to ongoing issues of racial oppression, injustice, police violence, protest. And so it's a pleasure to pass the mic now to Miranda Clark-Binder and to Mey-Yen Moriuchi in order to lead us through this cafe, this week's cafe, Art and Activism. What is art's role during times of crisis? So I will now pass the mic to Miranda. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. I am going to share my screen. Can everyone see my slideshow? All right. Thank you, Tara, and thank you, Brother Ernest, for your remarks, and thank you to the Joint Commission for joining us here today. And welcome to all of our LaSalle community. We are so grateful that you could join us for our conversation today, Art and Activism, what is art's role during times of crisis? Amidst the global COVID-19 pandemic, the upcoming US election, and the ongoing protests in the United States, around the country, and here in Philadelphia, works of art and the artists who create them are critical to movements for social and political change. Today in this cafe, we will briefly discuss some historical examples from our collection and around the world where art has been created and or used to raise awareness, advocate for change, and express a range of emotions, including grief, fear, anger, and frustration. Then we will invite you to participate in breakout discussions about issues and artworks. We'll also discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of art as a social and political tool, and conclude by asking you, our LaSallian community, what you think of art of the future should look like. This first image here is of a projection artwork by the artist named Dustin Klein. This is projected on the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia. The Robert E. Lee Monument is 6 stories high and is on Monument Avenue. It is on state-owned land, and so there's been court case about removing it or not. It is one of the very few, if only, Confederate monuments still standing in Richmond. And the artist says he will continue to project these images. So the face images change to different important people in Black Lives Matter and throughout history. That he will continue to do that until the monument comes down. So that's what we're looking at. I am presenting today with Dr. Mey-Yen Moriuchi, Associate Professor of Art History of LaSalle University. So thank you again, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Moriuchi, for joining me today.
Hi, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and to welcome you all to this Explorer Cafe on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I am happy to see so many familiar faces, and I want to echo Miranda's thanks to Brother Ernest and Tara and the Joint Commission for their support. I am beginning with this question, why do we need art in times of crisis? Art allows us to examine what it means to be human, to voice and express, and to bring people and ideas together. Art is an expression of what it means to be human. Art fosters understanding in communities. Art is good for our health. Art can be a public health tool during a pandemic and other health crises. Art helps us express gratitude during difficult times. Art allows us to document and process events. Art can be an instrument of social and political change. These particular bullet points, these responses were part of a blog that I'm copying here, and they very much tie into our conversation today. And we will in particular be focusing on that last bullet, how art can be an instrument of social and political change. And we will begin with some historical examples.
So all of the examples on this slide are by the artist Kathy Kolwitz, and they are all examples from the works on paper from the Salle University Art Museum. Art as a political tool, as a form of protest, has historical precedent. Well, we could look back at the ancient world and architecture and how buildings and temples were created to show strength. In the literature, we could go all the way back to the Aeneid and its celebration of the Roman Empire. There's even the British Museum has a brick on view from ancient Babylonia that is a protest to Nebuchadnezzar. So this idea has great precedent. Throughout history, and this is a quote, artists have participated as adamant reactionaries to unjust political actions. This has been incredibly important and particularly noticeable in the last 100 years. So these examples here on this slide are all historical images from our collection at the Salle University Art Museum of important political and social art. And of course there's more, but I just wanted to sort of, in the last 100 years, everything from, in the upper left-hand corner, we have a female printmaker in Mexico, prints of the Mexican Revolution, Jacob Lawrence, The Builders, and he has a great migration series, Elizabeth Catlett, and a celebration and fundraiser for the Legal Defense Fund of the ACLU. WPA era, so post-Great Depression prints of the Children's Clinic, unemployment lines, food after flood. This print here is a contemporary artist. This is from 2013 of the Women of Juarez, to this very beautiful, very hopeful print printed in 2008 by a Philadelphia artist named Alan Edmonds. So most of these, you'll notice, are works on paper and they are prints. And we're going to show, mostly today, you'll find we're talking about public art, we're talking about murals, and we're talking about prints, because prints are such a democratic art form. They can be made relatively inexpensively. The message can be shared. They can easily be pasted up and taken down and sent around the world, which is really, you know, these artists thinking about this social message and this democratic art form. And so that's what a lot of these from our collection, why they're the works on paper.
Other examples from around the world, I just brought in a few. I have, as examples of anti-war political art. I have Guernica, Picasso's Guernica in the upper left-hand corner, created by Picasso to document and communicate an injustice that was happening in his home country of Spain, in Guernica, where Hitler had collaborated to bomb this town of civilians as part of their bombing practice. This becomes an anti-war statement that travels around the world and spends a lot of time in the United States before settling back in Spain. In the lower left-hand corner, we have another example of a Spanish artist, Salvador Dali in this case, also protesting and providing an anti-war stance against the Spanish Civil War. And then the other two images here I draw from the Mexican muralist movement. And I wanted to make the connection between Mexican muralism and some of the murals in our city of Philadelphia. The Mexican muralists believed and championed that art, and particularly murals and prints, art in public spaces, could be instruments of social and political change. And the muralist movement in particular has, which happened right after the revolution, during and after the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s, 30s, muralist movements around the world, and even our mural arts program here in Philadelphia. Another thing I want to just lay out there in terms of context are monuments and historical monuments that have been controversial and part of debate and conversation, particularly in recent months. Monuments are traditionally created, constructed to memorialize and to honor individuals and history. And they symbolize power. And they symbolize a particular viewpoint of history and a particular power dynamic. And so the sculptures that you see here range from the Frank Rizzo monument in Philadelphia, which was recently removed, to the Christopher Columbus statue in South Philly. And then the others might look also familiar to you. The General Robert E. Lee statue we saw earlier being projected with Dustin Klein's visual projections, and then the Teddy Roosevelt statue on the right. It's these public monuments structure our spaces, our public spaces. And as times change, right, as social dynamics change, as demographics change, our monuments should change. And so we tend to think of monuments as permanent, as monumental, as unchanging. But these dialogues, these conversations have to continue to change those views. And there's a belief that monuments can change too.
So that is our sort of quick, as a museum and educator and an art historian, we could talk forever about the background and historical context of the art, but that's not the point of this. So we have our first breakout discussion. What we're going to ask is, in your breakout room, discuss the following questions. Assign a reporter to your group to take notes, and then we'll come back and we'll share out with the larger group. The questions we're asking you to consider today. What other artist artworks come to mind when you think about art and activism? And what are some of the social and political issues that you think artists should address and advocate for? Okay. What other artist artworks come to mind when you think about art and activism? And what are some social and political issues that you think artists should address and advocate for? Would anyone like to share what their group came up with? Dr. Dixon, please, I can't see everyone's face, so please feel free to jump right up, or call right out. But yes, Dr. Dixon, go ahead.
I would like to say that I did not offer anything in my group, which was filled with students. I'm an art history professor too, for those who don't know. But the students in the group came up with the Guerrilla Girls, and they understood that they used prints, among other things, to relate their message about, injustice regarding women's representations in the art world. We talked about Banksy as well, and that kind of sidetracked us a bit into talking about this issue of anonymity and what that allowed sort of social activist artists to address it, but also regarding, like, that there were problems with that too, that sometimes those artists aren't taken seriously. So maybe that was a little sidetrack we went. We talked about the public monuments. Oh, so in terms of issues, I should say racism was on people's mind, domestic violence. One person suggested that she sees art created by survivors of domestic violence in particular. COVID-19 was another issue that my group thought should be addressed, as well as Black Lives Matter. We had many other really some interesting side issues, but I'll let others speak now.
Excellent. Dr. Reagan, your group?
Yeah, we didn't have many people very experienced with art, visual art, but we mentioned ACT UP, the Grand Fury that made this, silence equals death, and how that relates in certain ways to Black Lives Matter art. And we talked also about music and film, and like Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, one person mentioned, still very relevant today, and movies like The Florida Project, which bring to light homelessness, and the issues we brought up in our group that
we feel haven't been covered as well, that art could really speak about, include human trafficking, including the home behind Salle that, you know, was involving trafficking, and food scarcity, just the extent to which, you know, people who aren't necessarily homeless, but, you know, more middle class are suffering from food scarcity now. Also the opioid epidemic, including in Philly, and climate change.
Yeah, wow. So many issues. And I really like that you guys also talked about non-visual art. You know, Man and I, as our backgrounds go, really focused on art and sculpture in this, but of course that there are, you know, art forms across the board where artists are addressing those issues. So it's a really important point. Who else would like to contribute? Yes, Dr. Kennedy?
Sure. Our group brought up Banksy as well as somebody who works, you know, does political art, and some of the topics that we came up with, the students came up with their first responders, art that, you know, sort of celebrates them, the poverty gap, climate change, and also pandemics, both past like historic pandemics, but also how to stay safe in the current pandemic.
Definitely. We think that art has a great use as a public health tool, for sure. Who else would like to report on their Inti Zoran?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
So my group, we actually talked about the mural, the George Floyd mural right there in the middle of the screen. And we also talked about how social media, many social media influencers and accounts use graphic design as a way to express their information in art.
Yes.
And then for topics, we talked about the ongoing racism and healthcare and mental health should be expressed more through art.
Mental health, interesting. Okay. Very cool. Anyone else like to share what their group came up with?
I can share what we had talked about.
Yes.
We brought up graffiti also, and the power of graffiti as either, and we were in a group of non-artists, so you will have to forgive us.
Oh.
We thought about graffiti and even like grassroots graffiti, right? Not just someone who's famous, but just from the community and the power of that. And I do gun violence work. And so using that art form in gun violence, and I am in public health, we use art a lot, but we don't use it. We talk to the professionals to do it. And so, you know, kind of collaborating, or like the community doing that work. And we had talked about the AIDS quilt and the graffiti that sprung up around the AIDS activism in the 80s and how powerful that was in pushing the Reagan administration. We also talked about music and the power that music can have. And then we talked about some of the tobacco work that I've done where we've worked with artists to kind of collect litter. It's like the last, my public health plug, it is our last acceptable form of litter is cigarette butts. And so like collecting that and working with that and sculpting that, the city and other institutions have done that to kind of talk about the intersection between tobacco and climate and, you know, working with artists on that.
Very cool. Very cool. So many good thoughts. Would anyone else like to share? Anyone else like to share?
In my group, we also talked about graffiti, and especially we said that it's important to also like kind of analyze why that form of like individualistic self-expression is viewed as like vandalism versus like other murals. So that was something that we brought up. And then also with social media, probably some people wouldn't qualify this as art, but we said that memes also kind of have a similar impact where we take something very difficult to talk about and we make it more creative and approachable. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, social media plays a huge role in our lives every day, right? Every day. I don't think that can be understated. Would anyone else like to share? Anyone else like to share? So some of the images that we came up with and artworks and issues your groups addressed. So we have a big Gorilla Girls here at the top, the George Floyd mural, Keith Haring, Fight AIDS, Act Up for the AIDS epidemic, to Banksy, which a lot of us mentioned. What we didn't, so the controversy around public monuments is a very long and complicated, has a long complicated history, which I think Dr. Moriuchi is going to mention, but this Karen Olivier here, this reflective box. So Karen Olivier is a Philadelphia artist, and she installed this in Germantown in Vernon Park as part of Monument Lab, and Karen Olivier will come up again at the end of our talk, but sort of reflecting the neighborhood, reflecting the community, the people going to visit this, instead of the typical statue which is there. So that's very cool. And we have climate, indigenous rights. Dr. Moriuchi, I realized we didn't include anything about climate change in this slide, did we?
We'll talk about it later.
We'll talk about it later. Okay.
So I'm going to just list some of the art and activist issues that came up and then some, and I think we need to add a few based on the conversations we've just had. So, you know, there are many, and this is a limited list, but a beginning. So political reform, immigration, human rights activism, Black Lives Matter and racial justice, global health, gender injustice, environmental justice and climate change, public history and memory, indigenous rights, decolonization, and many, many more. The next few slides are visualizing or providing some visuals on 4 of these issues to give you a range of the type of artwork and type of work that artists are doing to raise awareness.
So on the topic of immigration and human rights, so what I chose here were mostly, again, prints from the collection of the LaSalle University Art Museum. We have a very thorough collection of prints about immigration because we had an exhibition in 2015, Border Crossings. If you wanted to see all of the prints and find out more information about that exhibition, you can type Border Crossings into the database, which is right there at the bottom of this slide. But so here we have everything from farm worker justice, created through the Just Seeds print collaborative here, to stop the criminalization of migrants. Here also a Just Seeds. So Just Seeds is a print collaborative organization of artists who get together and gives them access to printmaking and also an international audience. These are both by an artist named Mazadal. He's a street artist from Mexico City, actually. Ernesto Llerena, who's this little guy right here, this little girl, I should say. Michelle Angela Ortiz, who is a really phenomenal Philadelphia-based artist, has done murals with the Mural Arts Program, which is what we have here. But we have a print of hers in our collection, which you see here. This print was made from her installation as part of Monument Lab in Philadelphia, which was on the Compass Rose of City Hall right here. And then this one is called Border Patrol, and was also featured. So lots and lots of contemporary artists addressing issues of immigration and human rights.
Black Lives Matter, racial justice, as you can imagine, has gotten a lot of prominence in the recent months. You guys have mentioned the George Floyd mural. Miranda talked briefly about the Dustin Klein light projections against the Robert E. Lee Monument. I do want to just say a plug in for the DART program. So Dustin Klein studied animation in college, and he learned how to do light projections, started working with the music industry that dried up during COVID, and he started creating these light projections on this monument. And you can purchase prints for as little as $10 and all proceeds go to Black Lives Matter. And that's another way for these artists to, raise awareness, but also contribute to the cause and encourage activism in particular movements. Some of the others, the one on the lower left, End Racism Now, was on the street in North Philadelphia. Some of you might have seen that. The other Black Lives Matter on the street was in Charlotte, North Carolina. Matter print up here is by Ernesto Llerena.
And it is a free download on his website, which if you're interested, ask me and I'll give you the address, but you can download that for free and print it out. He's made that available for free. Global health crises, historically, we did mention, I mentioned before, Keith Haring and the AIDS epidemic. Specifically here, we're thinking about COVID as a global health crisis. Here in this big mural, the Philadelphia Mural Arts Program partnered up with Mask Up PHL to paint masks on 5 important murals around the city. And so this is the Marian Anderson mural at the Marian Anderson Rec Center. And she has a mask on. There's an article about that in our LibGuide too, if you are interested in following up more about that. These 2 are also public art murals. These 2 are in Berlin. So wanting to show this sort of the global expanse of this health crisis, from all around the world. There is an amazing website. It also has Facebook and Instagram, and it's, everyone who works with me knows it's like my favorite thing ever, called amplifier.org. Amplifier.org had a call for artists to create COVID-themed art, and artists, they don't just do COVID, they do all sorts of crises. But the art is available as free downloads. You can print it out. And so this was, I took this from their website because they allow you to use their images for free. And just a variety of contemporary artists addressing all of these really amazing issues. And that website is going to be at the end of our presentation. But so these are all sort of public health COVID-themed artworks.
And last of our images to share, our artists to share, is on the theme of gender and justice, which of course has been going on for decades. So I have a bunch of different images that range back to the 70s to the present day. There's been a recent surge of art depicting RBG. The Gorilla Girls, this is one of their most well-known posters. Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? And although this was done in 1989, they recently did a study about 10, 15 years after this, and they realized that things haven't changed very much. So they continue to be active and fighting for gender equity in the arts and in institutions. Your Body is a Battleground is by Barbara Kruger. This was created as part to advocate for women's rights and abortion rights. I guess I won't go through all of them because we're coming close to time, but just to say that there are lots of artists that are continuing to fight for gender equity and gender justice, not only in terms of women's rights, but also trans.
Mm-hmm. So what we have done here is, because we knew that there was a good chance we would run out of time. So we are not going to break out into this discussion today, but something that we would like to encourage our community, encourage all of you to think about are, what are some of the advantages to art as a tool for political and social change, and what are some of the disadvantages? So again, we're gonna skip the question because we really want to dig into the final question. Unless if anyone feels that they do want to answer this, please feel free to type your answer into the chat. We would be happy to see them. What are some of the advantages? What are some of the disadvantages?
This is me, right?
Yes, this is, did anyone, yeah, there's nothing in the chat, so I think we're okay.
Okay, so yeah, feel free to continue to think about advantages and disadvantages of having or using art, thinking about art and activism or art in this activist way. But we wanted to have some time to talk about this final question, and we will do it as a group. So we will use the chat function, or if you want to raise your hand. So what should our art of the future look like? And as you've been seeing, the art of the future is art that's accessible, art in public spaces, art that is non-traditional, of murals and graffiti, posters, free downloads, right, through social media. I do want to give a little bit of background to these images that we've chosen to share with you. I left off talking about historical monuments a few slides ago, and I wanted to mention a good point that was raised in the chat by Dr. Osa, in that those historical monuments, many of those Confederate monuments at least, were not created at the end of the Civil War, but in fact, at the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century, as symbols of oppression, right, as symbols of white supremacy. And to regulate, right, public spaces, to segregate public spaces and infer who belonged and who didn't. And there's dialogue now. So what are artists doing? How are they getting involved in this dialogue? And the image in the upper left-hand corner is by an artist named Kehinde Wiley, most famous perhaps for his portrait of Barack Obama. But he was commissioned by the Museum of Fine Arts, which is in Richmond, not too far away from Monument Avenue, where the Lee statue and many other Confederate statues were until recently present. And he created his own equestrian monument in contrast, or to be in dialogue with those Confederate monuments. And I don't know if you can see very well, but instead of a white man, he's replaced the figure on a horse with a black man, a young black man with dreadlocks and a hoodie and wearing Air Jordans. So rethinking, right, who is represented and who is represented in positions of power. The other sculpture I want to mention is another work on the upper right by Hank Willis Thomas. And I think you should be able to see that when this was first displayed, it was temporarily on view. It was in direct viewpoint of the Frank Rizzo statue that you see in the background. The sculpture is called All Power to All People. An Afro pick that ends in a fist, a black fist. Both of these works versions of these works are in Philadelphia now and have been placed in locations in West Philadelphia. So I would encourage you guys to see the versions that we have in our city. Breonna Taylor has a mural. This is in Oakland, California. There have been other murals across the nation honoring her and other recent victims of police brutality and violence. The work on the lower right is a memorial that was designed by Karen Olivier that Miranda just mentioned. She was commissioned to create a memorial in honor of Dina, who was an enslaved woman that worked at Stenton. So again, reimagining our memorials, reimagining who gets commemorated and who is honored. And so this is part of the future, right? These are our conversations that are taking us forward. The image in the right is by Shepard Fairey, who is also famous for a portrait of Obama. In this case, he's also asking us to think about the future and how we can move forward. There are some things going in the chat, so I'm going to try and
there's a lot of really interesting conversation in the chat about, the advantages of using art for, the fact that it can be digested more quickly. And it's interesting, there's visual art sometimes only reaches certain people. And so other forms of art, poetry, music, those are the sorts of, there's all sorts of interesting things going in the chat about advantages and disadvantages. Does anyone have anything they'd like to, what should our art of the future looks like? What should we, Dr. Longo mentioned about the importance of representation and how representation matters. everywhere. So I think we're definitely saying that here in our art, but does anyone else have contributions?
Speaking of representation, this is going to go a little bit afield of art, I guess, in the way that we're thinking about it. I'm thinking of it actually in animation. My husband and I just watched She-Ra, the animated show. I guess we did this about a month ago. And in that show, there is a set of gay dads that are a couple, which was surprising to us because we don't often see gay dads. And the way in which they behaved were similar to myself and my husband, ways that are not important for this conversation, other than to say that it was very interesting for me to kind of see how much just seeing that representation, even the differences and similarities, kind of inspired me to think about my own, life with my now husband and our future kids and our parenting styles. And it really kind of made us, helped us envision a future that, while we had, of course, been thinking about what that would look like, just seeing some type of representation really kind of made that feel more concrete and made us think maybe a little bit differently or more expansively about it. And it also made me think about other things that we don't often see, in our visual media that could also be, really inspire people to think about things that they hadn't considered or to finally see themselves in a way that they don't often see themselves. So that was just one small example I just wanted to share about representation.
But exactly the point we're making about the strength of representation. And again, lots of information, lots of examples in the chat of television shows and protest music, right? And I'm trying to think of what else. Poetry, music, theater, how those can, the beauty of those things can open doors for people, which I definitely think is true. Anyone else have anything you'd like to say or to add? Or if I missed a comment in the chat, because there's 50 million, please feel free to jump in and contribute.
I'm going to really go out on a limb here.
Excellent.
I watched the Borat movie last week, and it is, so my family, we have at least one person that does not share the same political leanings. And I just said, it's over the top, like really ridiculous, like, and so tasteless in some ways, but that's what makes the point about what he's doing. The ability to laugh at something for me really allows me to appreciate the art of it. And it's, I don't know if it's clever because it's a little too out there, but it was really an interesting commentary on many, many things, including COVID and our current politics and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, movies too. Again, we can't underestimate the idea of all of these different art forms and their ability to reach audiences and to provide, to be a social and political tool for change. Oh, photography. Yes, definitely photography. Film. Oh, someone mentioned in the Babysitters Club series, right? So in literature, whether it's for adult or young people. Very good. Saturday Night Live. So I think there is a feeling about humor, right? There seems to be a common theme, especially when it comes to television, the humor. Art is an experience that stimulates all senses. Definitely. And so this, I should say, as I sort of stimulate all senses. So this Dinah memorial down here in the corner, which is by Karen Olivier, it's not built yet, but when it is, so if you're not familiar with Stenton, it is right near our LaSalle home on 18th Street. So it will be very, very easy for us to go and see that memorial to an enslaved woman in our very own neighborhood, probably in the next year or so. I think things got a little delayed, but it will definitely be up. Would anyone else like to contribute what art of the future should look like, what you're thinking about when, you know, again, we are thinking about visual art, but that is not the only, art can seem timeless, so timely, social and political messaging can be problematic as a disadvantage, true. I know conversations that I've had with people is that, you know, art often comes after the fact. So, you know, art comes after the episodes or after the issues that it's seeking to portray. I do think, so just to sort of finish our conversation of what art of the future should look like, Dr. Moriuchi, I think we're all in agreement that representation is an important part of the art of the future, right? Representation across the board, Are there any other comments today? Comment, question. Oh, tattoos. There we go. That's a great art form. I love that. Tattoos.
In our group, we talked about the suicide awareness and depression awareness, the semicolon project. That was huge.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, and I think mental health is not something that we mentioned in our brainstorm, but we also didn't mention domestic violence. But I was very interested to hear our community mention these. Very cool. A disadvantage. So art can be powerful, but also passive. So in our very conclusion here, you know, please feel free to keep adding things to the chat. I love seeing them, but being aware that we are running up on time. So if you have ways that you'd like to get to be involved, there are some really great resources here. Dr. Moriuchi, is this your slide or my slide?
I can talk about it. I mean, it's limited. We only had room for a few different websites, but the Amplifier Art is the website that has the posters that you can download for free.
So cool.
And the other ones there will point you in different directions based on your interest. But really, everything will be in the LibGuide, so you can access articles and books and websites that are linked to this topic. Thank you all for being here and participating in this conversation.
And I promise the LibGuide is very, very long because we keep sending more and more things. So there is all sorts of really super cool resources on there. So please do.
And just the word, Miranda and I will be sticking around for another few minutes. So if anyone would like to stay and share, you know, something that you weren't able to share in the larger group, please feel free to stick around.
And thank you everyone for coming and participating and thinking about this with us. Very timely, very timely.